Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to transition now from risk factors to protective factors that were found in Campbell's sample. So first of all, they found that the abuser having a college education versus a high school education was seen to be a protective factor. Or if the abuser was unemployed, if they had a college degree and were looking for work, this was found to be a protective factor as well. Also, living apart from the abuser or never having lived with the abuser at all was found to be a protective factor. They also found that having sole access to a firearm as the victim or potential victim was a protective factor, but they found that this relationship didn't hold true after controlling for relationship variables like never having lived together or leaving a relationship after having lived together. So this underscores the importance of having sole access to that firearm because, as we talked about before, the inverse was not true where the abuser had access to a firearm. Also, previous arrest of the abuser for domestic violence was observed to be a protective factor. So this provides some evidence that arrests for domestic violence have a deterring effect or are effective in some capacity for protecting against femicide. It could be the case that domestic violence behaviors are an escalation towards femicide in some cases that may be tempered by intervention by arrest, but that could perhaps be interpreted in some different ways as well. So factors that were not associated included first race or ethnicity, and these were found after controlling for demographic factors to not be associated with femicide. So that's important to note because race and ethnicity, in this case, shared some common factors with femicide, but those were factors that could better be explained by demographic factors, or it might be more apt to say that race and ethnicity shared a relationship with femicide that could be better explained not as being caused by race or ethnicity, but more so related to demographic factors that underlie race or ethnicity. They also found that abusers' excessive alcohol use was not an associated factor with femicide. Alcohol abuse or drug abuse by the victim was not associated. Stalking behaviors by the abuser were not associated with femicide, and threats of harm to children were also found to not be associated. And I have a question here that might help to shape some of your thinking about this material and maybe help you formulate some discussion posts. Why is knowing that these factors, or some of these factors, or one of these factors in particular, why is knowing that they're not associated with femicide important? So I'll leave that with you to think about a little bit. Some of the implications that the authors drew from their findings were first that the traits of perpetrators are typically thought to be characteristic of violent criminals in general, tended to not describe perpetrators of intimate partner femicide. So this has predictive value in helping professionals to understand in which cases or scenarios individuals may be at a heightened risk of femicide. They also found that arrests of abusers may protect against future intimate partner femicide. And this is helpful to know that arrests are effectively a deterrent in this way for professionals, namely police. They also found that the victim owning a gun and living apart from the abuser may reduce risk for intimate partner femicide. So whether this is because the gun acts as a deterrent for the abuser, it's kind of left to interpretation. What is very important is that the weapon is under sole control of the victim, and the abuser does not have control or access to the weapon, because as we see, the inverse is not true, that if an abuser does have access to a weapon, it is a risk factor for femicide. The authors also posited that the findings provide evidence that one could potentially reduce overall rates of homicide and intimate partner femicide by increasing employment opportunities, preventing substance abuse, and restricting abusers' access to guns. So these are things that have implications for macro level intervention into the issue of intimate partner femicide. So how does this all relate to child welfare? There are some obvious reasons that I'm sure that you can all draw on your own. But as far as domestic violence, outside of cases involving femicide, so we're speaking non-lethal domestic violence. How does domestic violence in its non-lethal form relate to child welfare? Well, it's fairly conclusive that children living in homes where domestic violence is occurring are also at risk of parental violence. So that is to say that domestic violence and parental violence commonly co-occur at high rates. And in a highly cited paper by Apel and Holden, they reviewed 31 empirical studies that provide, as they call it, overwhelming evidence that children who live in homes where domestic violence is present are at a high risk of being physically abused. So this is pretty substantial linkage between the topic of domestic violence and child welfare. So that brings us to some of my own work, not necessarily my work in generating research, but in compiling and reviewing. This is kind of the basis of what I'm working on right now. But this is a review of risk factors for co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence, where I took 12 empirical studies, compiled them and reviewed them to formulate a comprehensive list of risk factors that predict the co-occurrence of domestic violence and child maltreatment. I only selected studies that had a control group, so that's to say that only studies where there were risk factors that were discussed for co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence, as well as a control group that they could be contrasted with. So a group where there was only domestic violence or only child maltreatment. So that's to identify factors that are either different in their typology, so they're different factors altogether from where only one type of violence is happening in the family, or they were different in magnitude. So let's say, for example, drug or alcohol misuse was found to be a risk factor for domestic violence or child maltreatment. Well, what we were seeing, or what can be seen in empirical studies, is that type of risk factor, it's seen at a much more serious degree where co-occurring violence is happening in a home. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the risk factors that were identified in literature for co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence. First was the caregiver having a history of adverse mental health. So in most cases, this just involved reporting a diagnosis of some sort. In some studies, it was kind of nonspecific what type of mental health or adverse mental health participants were reporting. But that was a very common risk factor, was adverse mental health of some kind. Another risk factor that was common was the perpetrator having a history of criminal activity that wasn't necessarily associated with domestic violence or child maltreatment. So in most cases, it in fact was not associated with either these types of violence, so they had a standalone history of criminal activity. Also, another risk factor that was common was a history of substance misuse. This, again, was not always clearly defined. So what constitutes misuse? Who identifies the misuse? So is it self-identified? Was it professionally assessed? So different studies defined this differently, and this points to one of the implications of the review of literature was that some of these measurements across studies weren't consistent. So in future research, folks should narrow their definitions a little bit better so that we can have a much stricter idea of what the risk factors are that underpin this kind of violence. But having said that, we'll move on. The perpetrator having a history of maltreatment in their childhood was found to be a risk factor for this kind of violence. The caregiver, either the perpetrator of violence or not, lacking a social support network, was also found to be a risk factor. The caregiver, either perpetrator or not, achieving a lower than average level of education. So I say lower than average, again, that's kind of a symptom of the loosely defined education used from in each study. In most cases, they said lower than high school education was a risk factor. Caregiver stress, again, either perpetrator or not, was a risk factor. So if caregivers are observed to be under a heightened level of sustained stress, then this was something that could be seen as a risk factor for this kind of co-occurring violence. And the family being low income or experiencing an instance of financial difficulty, for example, a death in the family, sickness in the family, or the loss of a job, was also seen to be a risk factor for this kind of violence. And finally, physical health concerns of either parent were a risk factor, and severe interparental conflicts outside of or leading to instances of domestic violence or child maltreatment were seen to be risk factors. So if anybody's interested, this is a list of all of the studies that were reviewed and each of the studies that found each of these risk factors. If you find this entirely underwhelming, I don't blame you at all. So we'll move on from that. The implications of this, just a couple that I think are important, are that this kind of research can potentially increase the success of early detection by professionals and inform appropriate services and interventions as advocated for in SLEP, and O'Leary was a piece of work that was really strongly advocating for this kind of research. Also, kind of on that note, there is assessment tools for domestic violence only that are commonly used by police. So in Ontario, the OPP, they use the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, or have used. I believe that they just recently transitioned. So this is an assessment tool that helps police assess the level of risk that an individual is at for domestic violence. If they go out on a domestic violence call, they fill out this form and it helps them identify what level of risk they're at for domestic violence occurrences in the future. And my thinking is that if we know that domestic violence and parental violence are so intricately linked, then such a tool should exist to identify the risk of co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence. So we can know if there's children in the home, at what risk are they for this kind of violence in the future. But one such tool doesn't exist, and the research that would contribute to such a tool is very sparse. The 12 studies that I reviewed were really the only studies out there, and they were in different languages. They were French and English, so if you're not French speaking, then you can't really make much use of them. And a second implication that I'll highlight here was that these kinds of findings encourage a holistic perspective on family violence by acknowledging the effects of domestic violence on all members in a violent family, rather than focusing policy and research and programming on the prototypical view of an abusing man and a victimized woman and a witnessing child. So this is a perspective that was shared by a number of different authors in the past. I won't list them all like I did for the last implication, but it's this I think is a very important implication of viewing violence as something that encompasses a family and isn't necessarily pointed or directed at one member of families typically, as we kind of prototypically tend to view it. And I'll just quickly and briefly talk about the fact that there are impacts on children in their development of witnessing domestic violence. There's a wide breadth of neurological research that's coming out now that kind of speaks to these types of impacts at the neurological level. I have here listed suppressed IQ and neural reactivity to threat. So these are things that would follow somebody into their adult years, just having witnessed domestic violence. And these are two, I think, very robust impacts or very, very significant impacts on a person's development. So why is it important to know that domestic violence relates to child welfare? Well, these are the impacts of that relationship right here. And also speaking to the intergenerational impacts of family violence, there's in these studies here, they kind of speak to the fact that while a majority of individuals who experience maltreatment in childhood don't engage in intimate partner violence, a large portion of men who perpetrate violence against their female partners in the future were abused or exposed to family violence as a child. And I have et cetera here because there's a vast breadth of research and literature on the impacts of domestic violence on a child's development. So it is very impactful and significantly so. So just a couple discussion questions here that I thought might help to shape your discussion posts for the week. I hope you're not too tired of listening to me talk. At this point, though, you won't have to do it for much longer. So my first question here is, what are the risk factors that we explored for domestic violence or co-occurring domestic violence and parental violence that you feel are most important to target in interventions? Why do you feel they're most important? And how might you target these risk factors in your interventions? So this could be from the perspective of what kind of social work you're interested in practicing. If you're interested in practicing macro level, where you're working with organizations to change policy or perform research, or if you're interested in working at a micro level and in a face-to-face capacity with folks, how might these risk factors inform how you make your interventions? And the second question is, in light of the topics we explored, as a child protection worker, how might you change your approach to working with a family in which domestic violence has been identified? So those are just a couple questions. I hope that they help you formulate your posts this week. And that's been me. Thank you very much for listening.